Ever feel like society's got an opinion about, well, everything you do, what you wear, what you watch, even what you think sometimes?
Oh, definitely.
There's this constant kind of timeless tug of war, isn't there, between your personal freedom and, the power of the group. Why does the crowd get to weigh in on how you live your life?
It's the fundamental question, really. Where does the individual space end and the collective's authority begin? It's shaped governments, sparked revolutions. It still defines our daily interactions.
Exactly. And to really dig into that question, we're doing a deep dive today into a foundational text, a book that grappled with this very struggle back in the 19th century. And honestly, its ideas feel arguably more urgent now than ever.
We're talking about John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, published in 1859, yeah. It's this incredibly powerful defense of individual freedom against, well, all forms of coercion, not just from rulers, but from society itself.
And our source material for this deep dive, it comes straight from the horse's mouth. We've got key excerpts from the book, including Mill's own introduction. So it gives us direct access to his arguments, his concerns, and even a touch of his personal motivation.
That's right. We're reading the words Mill actually wrote, including that really deeply personal dedication where he credits all that is best in his writings, including this book, to his wife, Harriet Taylor.
Right, he says he's just interpreting her thoughts.
He describes himself as merely interpreting her great thoughts and noble feelings. Yeah.
Yeah.
It really underscores the intellectual partnership, the inspiration behind this classic work.
It definitely adds a layer, doesn't it? Knowing it wasn't just one brilliant mind, but this shared intellectual journey. So our mission today is to pull out the absolute essential nuggets from this work. The surprising facts, maybe, the core principles that might challenge your assumptions, and, parts that just make you stop and think. We want you to walk away with a solid grasp of what Mill meant by liberty and why his defense of it still packs such a punch in our modern, very interconnected world.
Okay, so let's unpack the central conflict that Mill sets up right at the beginning, this historical battle between liberty and authority.
He points out that for ages, this fight was mostly about protecting the individual from the ruler. Think of it as the sheep trying to limit the power of the shepherd, who might just turn into a wolf.
Right. People wanted checks on the power of kings, despots, tyrants.
Limiting their power.
Exactly. The ruler's power was seen as necessary. You needed order, protection from threats, but also inherently dangerous. So the focus was on building fortifications,
Right.
establishing rights, limiting the ruler's reach.
And then came the age of popular government democracies, republics. And the whole idea shifted, didn't it?
It did. If the rulers were the people themselves or chosen by the people, well, who did the people need protection from? Surely they wouldn't tyrannize themselves. That was the thinking.
But this is where Mill introduces his absolutely crucial and maybe kind of surprising insight.
Yeah, he argues the danger doesn't just vanish with popular government. In fact, a new kind of tyranny emerges because the people who rule are really just, well, the strongest party, the majority.
And the majority can absolutely desire to oppress a minority.
Or even just a part of their own number, yeah.
The tyranny of the majority. We hear that phrase all the time, but Mill was one of the first to really pinpoint it as a central problem, even in a democracy.
Yeah.
It's not just the king, it's us who can be the problem.
Precisely. And Mill goes further. He argues that protection is needed not just against tyranny from the government, the magistrate, but against something maybe even more pervasive, insidious.
What's that?
The tyranny of the prevailing opinion and feeling. Society itself. Through social pressure, judgment, shaming, it can impose its ideas and practices just as effectively as law, maybe even more effectively, because it gets into every corner of life.
Right. So it's that pressure to conform, to self-censor maybe, to not rock the boat with your lifestyle or your ideas, even if what you're doing doesn't directly hurt anyone else.
Exactly. That social pressure can be just as stifling as, say, state censorship.
It really can be.
And Mill notes that despite centuries of debate, the proper limit between individual independence and social control is still largely undefined in practice. We often just let custom decide things. We accept rules of conduct as self-evident just because they're what we're used to.
Even if they're based on nothing more solid
than the feelings or prejudices of the dominant group, yeah.
So we follow the rules because they feel right, because they're normal, not necessarily because we've thought through why they're the right rules.
That's it. And that brings us to the absolute core of Mill's argument. He proposes the single guiding principle for where that line should be drawn. It sounds deceptively simple.
Okay, what is it?
The only reason society, collectively or individually, is justified in interfering with the liberty of action of any adult member of that society against their will is to prevent harm to others.
The harm principle. My freedom goes right up to the point where it starts harming you.
That's the essence, yeah. And this principle applies to any kind of compulsion or control, legal penalties, sure, but also social disapproval, anything like that. If your action only affects yourself, if it doesn't impact the interests of others, society has no business telling you what to do.
Even if you think you're making a total mess of your life.
Even then, not even for your own good, as he puts it.
So it's really about self-sovereignty.
Mill would say absolutely. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. And based on this principle, he carves out 3 specific areas where individual liberty should be, well, absolute and unquestioned.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's the inner world of consciousness. This means complete freedom of thought, feeling, opinion, sentiment on any subject, religion, science, morals, politics, you name it. And crucially, the freedom to express and publish those thoughts is, like, practically inseparable from the thought itself.
Right. Can't separate thinking from talking about it, really.
Second, there's liberty of tastes and pursuits. The freedom to plan your own life, live it your way, do as you please without anyone interfering, as long as you don't harm others. Even if people think your choices are foolish or wrong or just plain weird, they can't legitimately stop you.
Okay, freedom of thought, freedom of lifestyle. What's the third?
Liberty of combination. Basically, the freedom to gather together with other people for any purpose that doesn't harm others, assuming everyone involved is an adult and is participating voluntarily, of course.
Got it. Those 3 areas,
Yeah.
they're like the fortress of individuality.
They are, and Mill saw this worrying trend in his own time, and it feels very familiar today, doesn't it? Of society's power over the individual just growing and growing.
Fueled by what?
Fueled by that very human desire to impose our own beliefs and lifestyle choices on others. He predicted this encroachment would only get stronger.
Okay, let's spend some real time on that first area then. The absolute necessity of freedom of thought and discussion. This feels so central to Mill, and it hits right at the heart of modern debates, Speech online, cancel culture, echo chambers, all of it.
It's incredibly relevant. Mill takes the old fight for a free press against kings, and he sort of reframes it. The challenge isn't just resisting a ruler censoring you, it's resisting any power, even the collective power of the public that tries to control what you can think or say.
He's really firm on this.
Oh, he's adamant. The people have no more right to coerce opinion than a king does, period.
And his core argument against silencing any opinion. It's brilliant, and it's devastatingly simple, isn't it?
It is. All silencing of discussion is an assumption of infallibility.
Boom. Mic drop moment.
Totally. If you shut down an opinion, you're acting as if you are absolutely 100% certain that opinion is false and that you possess the absolute truth. But Mill says, hang on a second. Are you infallible? Is your generation infallible?
Has any generation in history been infallible?
Exactly. We look back now and laugh or cringe at widely held beliefs from past ages. Surely, future generations will look back at our widely held beliefs and find some of them just as absurd.
Okay, so the first big reason not to silence an opinion is simply you might be wrong. You might be stamping out the truth.
Right. But Mill goes even further. He argues that even if a silenced opinion is false, suppressing it is still a terrible loss.
How so? Even if it's wrong?
Yes. And he gives several key reasons. First, he argues that false or unpopular opinions very often contain a piece of the truth. A grain of truth, maybe? Prevailing opinions, the ones most people agree on, they're rarely the whole truth. They're incomplete. And it's often only through the collision with error, the clash of different ideas, that the missing parts of the truth get revealed.
So you need the challenge, even a wrong challenge sometimes, to see the full picture of your own idea.
Exactly. He uses the example of unconventional thinkers like Rousseau. His critiques of society in the 18th century seemed radical, maybe even wrong-headed to many at the time, but they contained vital, uncomfortable truths about human nature and society that the prevailing wisdom was just ignoring.
Unpopular truth often needs loud advocates.
Sometimes one-sided advocates, just to get any attention at all, yeah.
Okay, so a false opinion might contain partial truth. What's another reason not to silence it?
Even if a true opinion is completely true, if it's never debated or challenged, it risks becoming a dead dogma.
A dead dogma. What does that mean exactly?
It means people hold the belief passively. They might repeat the words, they might tick the box on a survey, but they don't really understand it deeply. They don't feel it. It doesn't genuinely influence their conduct. It's just a rote phrase.
Like reciting something you memorized in school years ago, but you don't really grasp the meaning anymore.
Precisely. Mill uses the example of Christian doctrines from the New Testament. He observes how many people who call themselves Christians know the words, but their actual daily lives, their decisions, are guided more by custom or what their neighbors do, not by the profound principles they supposedly believe.
Because those principles aren't being actively engaged with.
Exactly. They've become dead dogma because they aren't constantly discussed, defended, challenged, lived.
So without that lively discussion, even important truths lose their meaning, their vitality.
They become just words. And this kind of busts that comforting myth, the idea that truth is somehow stronger than persecution and always wins out in the end.
Yeah, we like to think that.
But history shows that's just not the case. Truth can be effectively suppressed for centuries. Mill mentions various pre-Luther reform movements that were completely stamped out by force ideas that were true or contained truth, but simply weren't allowed to survive because their proponents were silenced, often violently.
So truth doesn't have some magical shield against power.
Not against dungeons and stakes, no. Its only real advantage, Mill says, is that if it's extinguished, it might be rediscovered later, maybe in a more favorable age. But that's a big if and can take a long time.
Now, we like to think we're past the age of, literal persecution.
Yeah.
We don't burn people for their opinions anymore.
Thankfully, no. But Mill points out that legal penalties for opinions still existed in his time. He mentions specific cases from the 1850s. People imprisoned for blasphemy or denied legal rights because they didn't hold certain religious beliefs, enduring horrible insults in court just for stating their honest convictions.
Wow.
And maybe even more powerful today, perhaps, is social persecution.
Social stigma. Cancel culture, maybe.
Yes, our merely social intolerance, as Mill calls it.
Right.
It doesn't involve the police or jail, usually, but it effectively forces people to hide their real opinions or just avoid expressing them publicly.
The fear of being ill thought of.
Exactly. Losing social standing, being excluded, maybe even impacting your livelihood if you're not financially independent. These social penalties can be just as effective at silencing dissent as legal ones, sometimes more so.
So what's the ultimate cost to society when that happens? When people are afraid to speak out?
It's huge. You lose intellectual vitality, you breed conformism, a kind of lack of moral courage. People with potentially brilliant but unconventional ideas get cramped in their mental development because they spend energy trying to twist their thoughts to fit the accepted mold rather than boldly pursuing truth wherever it leads.
And the world loses out.
The world loses the potential contributions of these timid but maybe promising intellects. So silencing dissent hurts not just the person silenced, but all of us.
Absolutely. And this is why Mill argues you must actively hear the strongest arguments from genuine opponents.
Right. Not filtered summaries from your own side or straw man versions, but the actual case put forward by someone who truly believes the opposite.
Why is that so important?
It's the only way to truly understand your own beliefs deeply and have rational confidence in them. If you don't have real opponents, he says, you basically have to imagine them and construct the most powerful arguments against your own position yourself.
That level of intellectual honesty and rigor feels, well, pretty rare today, maybe.
It's demanding, no doubt, but Mill argues it's essential. Without that constant challenge, your beliefs, even if they happen to be true, risk becoming those dead dogmas we talked about, just phrases you repeat without fully grasping their significance or having them genuinely guide your life.
Okay, so this powerful defense of freedom of thought, it naturally extends then to how we live our lives. Our freedom of action and self-regarding matters.
It does. Mill argues the same core principle applies. Just as suppressing an opinion assumes infallibility about what's true, interfering with someone's purely self-regarding actions assumes infallibility about what's best for them.
And society is rarely, if ever, in that position.
Pretty much never, Mill would say.
But isn't there some value in following tradition or custom? I mean, it gives life structure, doesn't it?
Mill doesn't completely dismiss custom, but he says simply following custom doesn't develop the uniquely human capacities. Things like judgment, discernment, making choices, moral preference. When you do something just because everyone else does it, you're not exercising your own faculties.
You're not really choosing.
Exactly. Mill uses this wonderful analogy. Human nature isn't a machine built to a specific model. It's more like a tree that needs to grow and develop in all directions, according to its own inner forces.
That's a great image. We're meant to flourish in our own way, not be stamped out of a mold.
Yes, and he argues that desires and impulses aren't inherently bad things. They're crucial parts of being a complete human being. Strong impulses are only dangerous when they're unbalanced, not just because they exist. Society, he contends, needs people with strong natures, with character, not just a mass of conformity.
What makes someone have character in his view?
People whose desires and impulses are their own, who are expressing their unique, developed nature, they have character. Those who just follow the crowd, well, he says they have no more character than a steam engine. Ouch.
He seemed to see society in his time, maybe English society specifically, as really having got the better of individuality.
He felt there was this overwhelming pressure to conform. People were constantly asking, what is customary? Or what's suitable for my social position? Instead of asking, what truly suits my character? Or how can I live a life that allows the best in me to flourish?
So conformity was king.
It dominated, he thought, even in people's leisure time. He describes it vividly, like everyone living under the constant watchful eye of a hostile and dreaded censorship.
And he makes the case that developing your individuality actually makes you more valuable.
Absolutely. First, more valuable to yourself, a person with developed faculties and a unique character has a richer, fuller existence, right? And consequently more valuable to others and to society as a whole. Individuality adds variety, interest, dynamism to collective life.
So it's not just a personal preference, like liking vanilla over chocolate. It's essential for societal progress.
Fundamentally, yes. Originality is the engine of progress. And it's not just about discovering new scientific truths. It's about finding new, better ways to live, to organize things, to relate to each other. Original individuals are, in his words, the salt of the earth.
Without them, things stagnate.
Without these people experimenting, setting new examples, challenging norms, life would become a stagnant pool, he warns. Even the best established practices would just become mechanical routines, devoid of life.
But let's be real, most people aren't highly original geniuses.
True, the truly original are always a tiny minority. But, Mill argues, in order to have them, you have to maintain a society, a kind of social soil in which they can grow. And even for the vast majority who may never originate a new idea or a new way of living, they can still benefit immensely from observing the experiments in living carried out by the more original minds.
He gives them choices.
Choices they might not have conceived of themselves, yeah. Exposure to different possibilities.
Mill seems really worried about what he calls the tyranny of mediocrity. What does he mean by that?
He sees a real danger as public opinion becomes the dominant force, especially in democracies. He notes that the public, or at least the rising middle class, which was increasingly dominant in places like England and America, tends to get its opinions not from deep, independent thinkers, but from people very much like themselves. Mass media often amplifies this.
So the standard becomes whatever the average person thinks. The lowest common denominator, maybe?
Kind of, yeah. The collective mediocrity. And the pressure to conform to that average is immense. This is why, he argues, the mere example of nonconformity, simply refusing to bend the knee to custom, is actually a vital service in the modern age.
Just being different is useful.
Precisely because eccentricity is frowned upon, embracing it, or at least defending the right to it, is desirable to help break through that suffocating tyranny of average opinion. He links eccentricity not just to strangeness, but potentially to strength of character, genius, mental vigor, and moral courage.
And forcing everyone into the same mold is fundamentally wrong because people are just different?
Fundamentally wrong. People aren't sheep. They need different conditions for their spiritual growth and well-being, just like different plants need different climates and soil. Trying to shape everyone according to one single pattern or model is detrimental because of the incredible diversity of human tastes, needs, and developmental paths. You crush potential.
He sees a modern, maybe even well-intentioned impulse that actually contributes to this push for uniformity.
Yes, the modern philanthropic spirit, the desire to improve people. Often, he thinks, it tries to do it by making them conform to a certain standard, a certain approved way of being. And this standard often implicitly or explicitly discourages strong individuality.
He uses that stark image.
The Chinese lady's foot. Compressing parts of human nature that stand out, crippling it to fit an artificial ideal. He explicitly compares this impulse to what he saw as the Chinese ideal of making everyone exactly alike, which he believed led to national stagnation, a powerful warning.
So advances that seem good on the surface, like better communication, more commerce, they make people more connected. But they also contribute to this pressure to be similar.
They do, in his view. They increase the flow of prevailing opinion, smooth out differences, and hasten assimilation. Mill felt it was urgent to assert individuality now, before this tendency towards similarity became so complete that it was irreversible.
He even gives that example from jury trials.
Yeah, where simply having non-commonplace habits or tastes was presented as evidence of insanity, it just shows how little value was sometimes placed on the right to simply be different, to live differently.
Okay, so we have the core principle, prevent harm to others. That's the line. But applying it gets complicated, doesn't it? Especially when someone's self-regarding choices have negative consequences, even if not direct harm to someone else.
Absolutely. The harm principle is the necessary boundary. Society can interfere to prevent harm to others. That's the sole justification.
So when is interference legitimate? Let's get specific.
Okay. Obvious cases are clear crimes like theft, assault, fraud, direct harm. But Mill also discusses cases where someone's conduct, even if primarily self-regarding, leads to them failing a specific duty they owe to others.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure. If someone's, say, extravagance or maybe uncontrolled gambling leads them to become unable to pay their debts or support their family that they're obligated to support, Mill says they can be justly punished. But, and this is really crucial, they are punished not for the extravagance or the gambling itself,
But for the consequences.
for the breach of duty, for failing to fulfill their specific obligation to support their family or pay their creditors. It's the harm to others, the family, the creditors, that justifies the interference, not the personal habit that led to it.
Like the example of the drunk policeman.
Exactly. A soldier or policeman being punished for being drunk on duty. It's the failure to perform their specific assigned duty that's the offense, not the private act of drinking itself.
Okay, so the line is drawn at the point where a specific duty to others is violated, or there's definite damage or a clear risk of damage caused to others.
Precisely. A definite damage or definite risk of damage to a specific individual or the public. That shifts the case from the realm of pure liberty into the realm of morality or law, where society has jurisdiction.
And conversely, when is interference not justified, even if society is horrified or disgusted by someone's choices?
When the conduct is purely self-regarding, when it doesn't violate a specific duty to others and doesn't cause definite harm or risk of harm to others, in that case, society has tools, education, persuasion, pleading, setting a good example, even avoiding someone if you dislike their choices. But it has no right to compel or punish that person for behavior that only harms themselves, even if society is absolutely convinced it's utterly foolish or wrong-headed.
And interfering just because you dislike someone's choices or lifestyle? That's a definite no-go for Mill.
Absolutely not justified. Mill really calls out this tendency for society to use its power to impose its own feelings or tastes on others, often disguising them as moral laws or social necessities. These are frequently based on nothing more solid than personal prejudice or liking, not on rational principles or universal experience.
He gives some fascinating, sometimes slightly odd historical examples of this kind of misplaced interference, right?
He does. He discusses the hypothetical idea of a Muslim majority prohibiting the eating of pork within their territory, or a group banning certain amusements like music or theater based purely on their religious views, like the Puritans did in England.
Why is that wrong, in his view?
Because no one's religion requires them to eat pork or attend the theater. So banning it based only on another group's dislike or religious objection is an illegitimate imposition of taste or belief onto others who don't share it and aren't harming anyone.
What about that strange example of the artisans using moral police?
Ah, yes, that's interesting, where artisans would sometimes ostracize or even bully more skilled or industrious workers who earned more by working harder or faster, trying to enforce a kind of wage equality or prevent others from showing them up. Mill uses this to show that if you grant society the right to interfere in purely private concerns, you can't logically complain when a smaller public, like a group of workers, asserts the same kind of authority over its members' work habits or earnings, even if it seems unfair. It shows the danger of the principle.
And he really skewers that argument sometimes used to justify things like temperance laws, the social rights argument.
Yes, that theory is particularly pernicious in his view. The idea that anyone who doesn't act as they ought in their personal life is somehow violating my social rights, like their bad behavior might cost me taxes down the line because it leads to disorder, or it harms my moral development just by exposing me to temptation or a bad example.
Mill calls that theory
Monstrous, because it implies an absolute social right for every single individual to demand that everyone else act perfectly in every respect. This would justify endless interference in the smallest particular of everyone's lives, which he utterly rejects as destroying all freedom.
He also takes a look at Sunday laws, restricting activities on Sundays.
Yeah, his take is nuanced. If the restriction on Sunday activities is based purely on religious grounds, say, enforcing religious observance on everyone, Mill would say that's illegitimate interference in liberty. But if it's framed as securing a shared day of rest for labor, a social regulation in which everyone has an interest, that might be a different matter. However, restricting voluntary amusements among those who want them, when they aren't harming others or forcing others to work simply because it offends a religious group, that's outside society's legitimate sphere.
And his take on the treatment of the Mormons in polygamy back then is quite revealing of how strictly he applies his principles, isn't it?
It really is. Mill was personally appalled by polygamy. He saw it as a retrograde step, fundamentally violating women's liberty and equality. However, he strongly condemned external societies trying to force the Mormons in Utah to abandon it via a civilizad, a kind of moral crusade backed by force or intense social pressure from the outside. He argued that as long as the individuals involved were consenting, even acknowledging that consent can be shaped by social norms, as is true in many forms of marriage, worldwide outsiders who were unconnected to them had no right to interfere with force.
Persuasion is okay.
Persuasion and argument, absolutely yes. Send missionaries, write articles, make your case. But military intervention or trying to compel them through external pressure, no. He throws in this great challenge. Maybe a civilization that's so afraid of being conquered by contact with barbarism might already be degenerate itself.
Wow. It's a powerful example of him sticking to the principle, no harm to non-consenting others, no right to compel, even when he personally found the practice abhorrent.
Precisely. Persuade if you can. Argue your case, but don't compel people in their self-regarding affairs, even if you hate what they're doing.
He does touch on some more nuanced applications, though, like regulating dangerous things, right? It's not always black and white.
Right. Regulating the sale of poisons, for instance, is legitimate. Why? Because the aim is primarily to prevent harm to others through crime or accident. Labeling dangerous substances is fine. The buyer usually doesn't want not to know it's dangerous.
What about requiring prescriptions or certificates?
That might be acceptable, Mill concedes, if it genuinely prevents criminal use without being an undue barrier to legitimate self-regarding use. The key aim has to be preventing harm to others, not merely preventing someone from potentially harming themselves through risky but voluntary behavior. It's a tricky line.
How about places like gambling houses or brothels? Things society often disapproves of.
Mill views these as activities that individuals choose to engage in among themselves, consensually. He suggests society's legitimate role might be limited to ensuring they are conducted discreetly, not becoming public nuisances or sources of disorder. Make them private, perhaps. He points out the moral anomaly of punishing the person who facilitates the activity, like the owner of a gambling house, but not the people who are actually doing it, the gamblers. If the act itself isn't illegal for the participant, why punish the provider? Society shouldn't aim at more than preventing public offense or coercion related to these activities.
And taxation, like sin taxes on alcohol or tobacco.
Mill justifies taxation on stimulants primarily as a fiscal measure, a way for the government to raise necessary revenue, not as a penalty designed to discourage the taste itself. He acknowledges the line can be blurry because higher prices might deter some people. But the core principle is that individuals should be free in how they spend their own income after they've met their obligations to the state and others. Taxing luxuries to raise funds is generally acceptable.
Okay, Mill also looks at the flip side cases where liberty is misplaced, where we think we're respecting freedom, but we're actually allowing one person undue power over another, and the state should interfere.
Yes, this is important. The most prominent example he uses is the family. He addresses the historical power of husbands over wives, stating very clearly this is not a matter of the husband's legitimate liberty to control another adult. It's a power imbalance that requires equal rights and legal protections for wives, enforced by the state.
And he's particularly strong, even maybe surprisingly so for his time, on the state's role regarding children.
Yes. Mill argues that misguided notions of liberty often prevent the state from fulfilling its essential duty to protect children. He felt opinion was overly sensitive about state interference with parental control, almost as if children were literally the property of their parents.
He calls it a moral crime.
A moral crime, yes, to bring a child into the world without a reasonable prospect of providing for their physical and mental well-being. If parents fail in this fundamental duty, the state must step in, ideally making the parents bear the cost if possible.
So requiring education is a perfectly legitimate state intervention in his view.
Absolutely. Mill is a strong advocate for the state requiring education for every child up to a certain minimum standard. However, he actually prefers that the state not be the sole provider of the education itself,
Why not?
to maintain diversity and avoid state indoctrination. He'd prefer parents choose how education is provided, public schools, private schools, homeschooling perhaps with state financial help for those who can't afford it.
But how could the state require education and ensure standards without controlling what ideas are taught, which goes against his other principles?
Through public examinations. Starting at an early age, the state could hold exams testing factual knowledge and basic skills. At higher levels, these exams should stick strictly to facts and positive science, steering well clear of disputed opinions or controversial topics like religion or politics.
So test what kids know, not what they believe.
Exactly. The state certifies competence in demonstrable knowledge without biasing beliefs. He gives the example. You can examine an atheist on the facts presented as evidence for Christianity or a Catholic on Protestant arguments, without requiring either to profess belief in what they're being examined on.
That's actually a pretty clever way to try and ensure educational standards without imposing a single state-approved worldview.
It's about giving individuals the tools, the knowledge, and skills to form their own opinions later in life, rather than the state dictating the opinions themselves.
And he connects this whole idea of responsibility for children directly back to the decision to have them in the first place.
Yes, very forcefully. He frames bringing a human being into existence as one of the most serious and responsible acts anyone can undertake. Doing so without being reasonably able to provide that child with the ordinary chances of a desirable existence is, in his view, a significant a crime against the child and potentially a burden on society.
And he
even suggests that laws requiring proof of the ability to support a family before allowing marriage, like some continental European countries had at the time, are perfectly legitimate interventions. Why? To prevent the foreseeable harm to the potential offspring and the burden on society. He finds it baffling that society often resists such restraints, based on a misplaced idea of liberty, while readily accepting restrictions on much less consequential personal choices.
It is a striking contrast, isn't it? We fiercely defend the liberty to create a life that might foreseeably be one of hardship and neglect, but maybe get up in arms about someone's harmless personal taste in music or clothes.
Mill found that kind of selective respect for liberty quite perplexing, yes.
Okay, so beyond the harm principle and these cases of misplaced liberty, Mill also outlines other reasons against government interference. These aren't primarily about protecting individual freedom, but more about practical considerations.
Right. These are reasons of expediency, as he might put it, not strictly liberty. They apply even when the government action wouldn't necessarily violate the harm principle, but it's still probably a bad idea. Often, it's simply because individuals or voluntary associations are just better suited to the task.
Like running local businesses or charities or community groups.
Exactly. Many activities from jury duty and local government functions to industrial ventures and philanthropy are often done better, more efficiently, and certainly with more vitality and learning involved, by individuals or voluntary groups rather than a central government agency. It fosters experience, develops people's practical abilities, and keeps things adaptable and innovative.
And state involvement tends towards that uniformity we discussed earlier, killing experimentation.
Precisely. State control usually means one standard model, one way of doing things. This kills the beneficial diversity of experiments that individuals and associations naturally provide. This leads to stagnation again. He brings up the Chinese ideal as a cautionary tale of what happens when everything becomes too uniform and centrally managed.
What's the state's best role in these areas then, according to Mill?
Often, its best role is not doing the activity itself, but acting as a central repository and diffuser of information. Collecting knowledge about the various experiments being tried on individuals and localities, comparing their results, and sharing the best practices widely, informing and advising rather than commanding.
But the most compelling reason he gives against too much government intervention, it sounds like a really serious worry, maybe especially relevant today with big government debates.
It is. It's the danger of consolidating too much power and activity in the state, creating a vast, dominant bureaucracy. If the government takes on too many functions running major industries, providing all education, managing infrastructure projects directly, it inevitably hoovers up the nation's most capable and ambitious talent into its own ranks.
Leaving the public outside the government less able to understand or critique it.
Yes, exactly. The public becomes less experienced, less capable of judging or controlling the bureaucracy, and eventually everyone, including the officials within the bureaucracy themselves, becomes kind of enslaved to the system, to the routine.
He uses some strong analogies.
Like the Chinese Mandarin system, or maybe even a highly disciplined religious order like the Jesuits. Highly organized, often very capable in routine matters, but ultimately stifling independent thought, initiative, and real progress because individuals become subservient to the vast centralized system and its established rules. This kind of bureaucracy lacks external challenge and internal dynamism.
So the big challenge is finding the balance. How to get the potential benefits of centralization, like information sharing, coordination, setting minimum standards without turning far too much activity and power over to governmental channels.
That's the crux of it. Mill suggests that balance is key. Maximum decentralization of actual power and activity, but potentially greater centralization of information and advice. Central oversight for gathering and sharing knowledge, diffusing best practices, ensuring minimum standards are met, like with education or maybe environmental protection today, but leaving the actual execution and most of the power firmly in local and individual hands. He mentions the Poor Law Board in his time as an example where central superintendence was necessary because widespread local failure was affecting the whole community, but cautions against applying that level of administrative coercion to purely local interests where local people should decide.
The government's role should be to enable and stimulate individual and local effort, not replace it.
That's the crucial line he draws. The real problem starts when the state substitutes its own activity for that of individuals and groups, instead of merely calling forth, assisting, and maybe coordinating their inherent powers.
Wow, okay, this deep dive into Mill's On Liberty really underscores how this tension between the individual and the collective is, well, ancient, but also how its form keeps changing, right?
Absolutely. It shifted, as Mill saw, from primarily confronting the power of a single ruler to wrestling with the much more pervasive influence of social norms, public opinion, and the potential overreach of even a well-meaning, democratic, but ultimately possibly stifling state apparatus.
Mill's harm principle remains this incredibly clear, if constantly debated, boundary marker.
And his impassioned arguments for freedom of thought and the vital importance of individuality, they feel incredibly sharp today. I mean, in a world just saturated with information, echo chambers, and all these pressures to conform online and off.
His reasons for why even a wrong opinion should be heard, because it might contain a piece of truth, or because unchallenged truth becomes meaningless, dead dogma. Those feel like essential reminders.
And that idea that your individuality, even your quirks, your eccentricities, aren't just personal preferences, but are actually crucial for your own growth and for the vitality and progress of society itself, that's a really powerful call to resist the subtle and sometimes not so subtle pressures to just blend in.
It really forces you to consider that maybe uniformity isn't peace, maybe it's stagnation.
Exactly. That's his fear.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into one of history's most ardent defenders of personal freedom, maybe here's a final thought to carry with you. Considering how often Mill shows us that societies have been profoundly wrong when they've tried to suppress ideas or force conformity in the past, how confident can you really be that our prevailing opinions, our customs, our norms today represent the whole truth or the absolute best way to live? And if the greatest danger Mill warned about wasn't necessarily outspoken dissent, but maybe that quiet, complacent conformity, what responsibility does that place on you to cultivate your own independent thought, to nurture your own unique individuality, and maybe to ensure that your deepest beliefs are vibrant, living truths, and not just dead dogmas?